Tribacodian Steve, and this time we're going to tell you a story about the Old West, and it sort of blends in towards the early days of 1900s. So the uniform's in keeping. You right, mate? You're trying to steal the stage? You're trying to steal the show? You steal the show anyway, mate. Okay, so what we're going to do, remember where we're at, the Old West, and so I'm going to run some names by you, and at this stage I want you to see if you can think what the connection between these people are. Calamity Jane, Buffalo Bill, Annie Oakley, Tom Mix, John Wayne, here's a curveball, John Travolta, Indiana Jones. Maybe now you're beginning to work it out. We're going to add Gene Autry, John Wayne, I said him already, Jimmy Stewart, the Marlboro Man, now the penny must drop. But no, it's not cigarettes. Hang on, cigarettes. I don't think I'm allowed to say that word anymore either. What can you talk about these days? In Australia anyway, you talk about those sticks, you get in big trouble. Lyndon Johnson, Ronald Reagan and George Bush. I don't know which George, one of them. Anyway, what have they got in common? Okay, I'm sure you've twigged, but for those that haven't, we'll set a few more clues. So we are now going to go to New Jersey, USA, and it's 1830, and a boy is born. A boy is born, he ends up being the 7th of 12 children. And he is not well. He is a sickly child whose family doctor says he's not going to live long. Back in those days, you know, it was nothing to have a child that lasted 5 or 6 or 8 and then they died. It was just seen as acceptable. This was a very sickly child, and so clearly it's not worth sending this boy to school. So he never learns to read or write. What happens is that he decides when he's a very young man and he's told that he's not got long to live, to go west, young man. So he heads off west and he gets to St. Joseph in Missouri. I always like to say Missouri because it's sort of the thing that Josie Wales would say. So he gets to Missouri and he gets himself a job working in a brickyard. Turns out he's a bit of a cluey bloke, and before long he's the manager in the brickyard. Such a successful manager, he actually manages to buy half a share in the brickyard. Now do you know where we're going, now that I've told you he's a successful brickyard owner? Well, not quite, because he's not had a half share for long before there's a serious flood. The whole brickyard gets washed away. It's worthless in an era before building insurance. He's penniless again. What's happened is there is a gold strike at Pikes Peak. So he heads off to the gold strike. When he gets there, the weather is very grim. People are trying to keep dry by camping in tents made out of buffalo hides, all except the untreated buffalo hides, and they become waterlogged and heavy and collapse. At this point the penny will drop, if it hasn't already, because that boy, 7th child of 12 children, was born into one of New York's most successful milliners, a hat making business. Now you know, don't you? So yep, John Stetson decides what he does know something about is making felt. So he starts using the buffalo hides, making felt, from which he is then making waterproof, lightweight tents. Very successful. While he's doing this, a mule train guy comes through and sees that John Stetson has made himself a very wide-brimmed hat to keep the weather off him. Now what had happened is John Stetson made this hat, and other people in the mining area, Pikes Peak mining area, were ridiculing him, saying it looks ridiculous. Now there's been a time or two when I've been in somewhere in Australia and I'm wearing one of my cowboy hats in Australia, and people take the piss out of me for wearing a hat. So I know what John Stetson must have felt like when people were taking the mickey out of him for this hat. But this guy with a mule train, he decided he liked the hat, and he bought it for $5, a lot of money back then. For $5 he bought this wide brimmed hat off John Stetson. That's finally when John Stetson thinks, hang on, I know about hat making, I've just sold a hat, I'm going to set up my own hat business. So he goes to Philadelphia, and in Philadelphia he sets up a hat making business. Now, sadly, at that time in America, European fashion was all the rage. So poor old John couldn't sell a hat to save himself. This is where you have to think outside the square. Any time you think of somebody that's been successful in business, it's because they've been, I think the marketing term is, they're ahead of the wave. They're doing, you've got to do it first. So John Stetson said to himself, hang on, I sold my very first hat to someone out west. I'm going to make these broad brim hats, and I'm going to send them, 2 or 3 of them, to every merchant cowboy outfitters that I can think of in the West, and sell my hats out west. He makes 3 styles of hat. They're all broad brim cowboy hats, but basically he makes them of 3 different standards of felt, and he sells the cheapest one for $5 a hat, another one for $10, and the top of the range for $30. Huge sum of money. And he finds he has an enormously successful business by selling wide brim cowboy hats through Western merchants, and it just explodes. He insisted on top quality even for his $5 hats, and his motto, his company motto that he would tell to anyone who listened, his motto was, no advert equals a well-pleased customer. Isn't that true? Word of mouth. So he relied on word of mouth in his early advertising. His early advertising, don't you just love this? His early adverts, the first known recorded adverts for Stetson hats was a Stetson hat and a horse drinking out of a cowboy Stetson hat. In the Texas Rangers Hall of Fame, they say Texas Rangers Stetson was used for drinking from, a fan to flame the campfire, a blindfold to lead a stubborn horse, a whip to slap a steer's rump, a blanket to smother a grass fire, and as a target in gunfights. They also had recorded there that it was a nifty place to store your valuables. So that's what Texas Rangers Hall of Fame says about the old Stetson hat. Eh? So, where do we get to? The next point is that when the Stetsons became so popular and lots of people are wearing Stetsons, they decided that people were going to customize them in a certain way, and those names took on, they became popular names for a hat. So one of them was the Carlsbad crease, and a Carlsbad crease is when the hat's rounded, you put a crease down the middle of it, all the way down the middle of it, like that. That was the Carlsbad crease. There's seen some cowboy movies where the cowboy's wearing his hat and the brim is just pulled down like that. That's called the barroom floor. And another one is called the Montana Peak, and I think the Mounties, and certainly the New Zealand mounted rifles, they were using what they didn't even realise is called the Montana Peak, which is the hat is pushed up like that, and then it has 4 squares put into it. So I also think the doughboys, World War I American troops, they had the Montana peak. And what this one is, of course, this is my favourite. I mean, it's what that. So this one is called the Gus. So that isn't an original Old West one, because of course when I refer to it being called the Gus, we're talking to Gus McRae from Lonesome Dove. But that's what that particular crease is called. Higher to lower, centre crease pushed in. That's the Gus. So everyone had these different names for the Stetson, all of which just add to its popularity and people wanting to have a Stetson. Who doesn't want to have a Stetson? So, in 1880, there was as is so often the case in that era, most of the records for Stetson Hat Company were destroyed in a fire. That is a shame. What is known is that the taxation department, whatever you want to call it, have kept records of the profit made. So in 1879, the Stetson Hat Company made $70,000 profit. By 1887, that profit had risen to $190,000 a year. In 1890, it made $333,000 profit, and that same year it is actually recorded the Stetson Hat Company made 1.5 million turnover, 333,000 being profit. In 1877, the Stetson Hat Company had 300 employees. At its peak, no pun intended, that's supposed to be a joke, not boring. At its peak, it had 5,000 employees. A hat company, 5,000 employees. In 1920, at the factory Christmas party, Christmas bonuses were given to the staff at the Christmas party that amounted to $525,000. $500,000 given in Christmas bonuses in 1920. It makes me laugh because he can't stop yawning. This must be one of our most boring videos yet. Anyway, 1901, John Stetson made 1 million hats in the year 1901. In 1907, that had climbed to 2.6 million hats. In 1917, that had climbed to 3.8 million hats. He had, in 1920, he is recorded of having 200 employees who received a bonus from the company for having worked for him for more than 25 years. You must be pretty happy in that era to work for the same business for more than 25 years. But why wouldn't you? He had factory doctors, and part of your employment was a healthcare package. He had a factory library. He had factory Sunday school. The factory set up a special fund for employees to get home loans. We are talking pre-1920, and the factory had its own gymnasium. It boggles my mind. Was the man ahead of himself or what? And last but not least, he ran a school so that employees could learn to be proficient in English and study and become American citizens. What a man. So he was supposed to die shortly after his birth in 1830, and he lived to be 76 years old. What a thing. It's all about karma. When you think of what he did for his 5,000 factory workers and how he looked after them, It's all about karma. Lived to be 76 years old. John Stetson, just amazing. Of course, what happens is we hit the 1950s. So what happened before that? It's pretty much rude, sorry mate. It's pretty much rude for a man to go out in public without wearing a hat. If you were a toff, you might have worn a top hat or a bowler hat. And if you were working class, you would have just worn a bit of a cap of some sort. But you didn't go out without a hat. Come the 50s and 60s, society starts changing in so many ways. I've said before in another video, used to be that a man's braces was considered underwear, and that's why you see guys out working wearing waistcoats, because it was considered rude to show your braces, because that was like a man showing his underwear. This was hard to get your head around. But that's why with blazing sun, blokes are out working in waistcoats because they didn't want to show their braces. Things change, 50s and 60s, less and less and less people start wearing hats, and the industry plummets to a degree where by 1970 they decide to shut down the business. In 1970, Stetson hats exist no more. Hang on, Steve, you say. You can go and buy a Stetson today. And you can. Look on the net, type in the word Stetson and look for a Stetson hat. What you will find, sadly, is it is not a Stetson hat made by the Stetson company. It doesn't exist anymore. In 1970, when they shut the business down, they sold the name. So now I could start up a business making hats, and I could call them Steve Stetsons. I can call, because I would pay a license fee to call them Stetsons. But of course they're not made by the Stetson company. And of course, just to round it up, when I said before all those names about people who've worn Stetsons, it's a pretty diverse range. When you think Tom Mix and John Wayne in the early days wore the big white 10-gallon Stetsons, and then we go through John Travolta, Urban Cowboy, wore them. Indiana Jones wore a Stetson in the Indiana Jones movies, and US presidents, certainly the US presidents that come from the South era, they had to wear those hats because they was part of showing the faith with their constituents, I guess. They're showing that they were good old boys too. They might have been multi-millionaires, but at heart, they were still good old boys, y'all. So anyway, there's the history of the Stetson. Fascinating story. If you want to see more of the bizarre and unusual tales of Trooper Cody and Steve, you make sure you stay tuned for our next upcoming videos. They are all over the place now, aren't they? And we'll be keen to see you on the trail sometime. Just make sure to make a comment, subscribe, hit that like, and we'll call it quits, eh? You done a fabulous job. As always, let's call it quits.